The Canon C70 is an amazing cinema camera, giving you serious filmmaking capability in an impressively small price and form factor. And as you'd expect, there are a ton of great reviews online about it from the likes of Gerald Undone, Philip Bloom, Tyler Stalman and many more. But there are a few points about the camera I had trouble figuring out before I bought it, and since I did buy it and I've been using it for close to a year now, I thought I'd share those here for the benefit of anyone else looking at this camera. So let's get into it. So just to be clear, this is not intended to be a full review of the C70, just me trying to fill in a few knowledge gaps based on my experience with the camera. So in no particular order, I'll be talking about my general impressions of the camera, boot time, power and heat, the codecs the camera supports and what codecs you should be shooting in, the bit rates the camera actually shoots at, particularly in slow and fast mode, a quick word on the camera's stills capability, and remote controlling the camera using the built-in browser remote feature. And by the way, this video is going to be shot in 4K UHD, so I can throw in some samples from the camera, but most of the video is not shot on the C70 because it's right here. I guess I'll just give you some quick impressions I have of the camera while I'm here. This might help you if you're on the fence about buying this camera. It's really difficult to explain what the C70 feels like because it's going to depend on where you're coming from. If you're used to mirrorless cameras, then the C70 is going to feel big and heavy because it's certainly heavier than most stills cameras. But if you're coming from a cinema camera background, then I think the C70 is amazingly light and compact for what it does. And I think that's the right way to look at it. The C70 really checks all the right checkboxes for a cinema camera. Built-in ND filters, which I've been used to for years and would have a hard time letting go of. That's one of the big things that made me buy the C70. Lots of external buttons, so all the useful functions are at your fingertips instead of being buried in menus. Timecode, not something I personally use, but for people who need it, essential. And most of all, great colour and image quality. The built-in codecs deliver great results, including internal RAW recording if you want it. The camera overall feels very solid and well built. There are some minor fit and finish issues. The display rubs ever so slightly when it closes, and some of the controls aren't perfect. But overall, the camera body feels like a brick. To get all of this in such a small package is really groundbreaking. You can carry the camera around in a really small pack with a selection of lenses. I have 3 pretty hefty lenses here, and all the ancillaries you need, and shoot without rigging anything, and still have space left over for a jacket and a sandwich. It's true that the setup I have here is really stripped to the bones. A lot of people would want to add an external monitor at the very least. And I have no audio. For the shooting I'm doing, I would take a pair of external mics and plug them into the camera's XLR inputs. And yeah, you need adapter cables for that, but that's no big deal. The point is that even with nothing added to the camera, apart from a lens, you can pull it out of your bag, press record and shoot. Of course, there's no limit to how much you can rig up a C70, but with this kit I can hike up a mountain and shoot stunning landscapes with a real cinema camera. There are copious buttons on the camera, all of which can be configured, and I certainly think there are enough, particularly if you can be a little selective about which focus and exposure aids you actually use. There are 3 control dials and a joystick, and 2 of the dials can be customized as well, though the lower dial is so soft that it's not a lot of use for ISO and so on. That's a shame, but it's not a disaster. There are plenty of other controls, and this is still useful for navigating the menus and so on. If you have an RF lens, the control ring on the lens can be configured as well. The built-in monitor is small but fairly bright, not to compete with direct sunlight, and it's loaded with exposure and focusing aids like waveform, which could be larger though, a vector scope, false color, focus guides, zebras, peaking and so on. For shooting log you can set a LUT on the monitor or not as you prefer. So all in all it works. Of course, adding an external monitor would be easy enough if you wanted to do that. There's a full-sized HDMI output. One thing the camera is sadly missing is an electronic level gauge. You can see my DIY solution. It works. The tripod attachments on the bottom of the camera are a bit weird, as many people have noted. There's a 3/8 hole in the middle and 2/4 inch holes either side, just slightly more than 50mm apart. But this Arca Swiss plate mounted sideways on the bottom works fine, and there are loads of cheese plates, base plates and cages available for the C70. Which is kind of just as well because the C70's own attachment options are pretty minimal. Basically, you've got the hot shoe on top, which has a 1/4 inch hole in the middle of it. I use this wooden camera top handle, which fits very securely to the camera and provides loads of attachment options. Boot time is fantastic. From powering on to actually recording, well, take a look, it's pretty swift. This means that you can shut down the camera to conserve power when you're not actually shooting. But then again, battery life is also fantastic. I get 3 hours of continuous 4K shooting from the BP A30 battery that came with the camera, and I have a Hanol HL A30 which gives about the same. You can get bigger batteries, but I can hardly see the point. There is of course an external power input, but I haven't tried that. Heat isn't much of an issue. I've never seen the camera actually overheat. The worst it does is turn the fan on. You can set the fan to turn off while you're actually shooting, but it will turn on again like after a couple of hours of continuous shooting. But it's so quiet that it's never really bothered me in any case. I have had the fan be audible when using an on-camera mic to record a really quiet ambience, but not otherwise. I gave the camera a quick test for low light shooting, totally inspired by Wolf Hall, just to see what the C70 could do by the light of one candle. The tests were deliberately shot dark and orange as it's supposed to look like candlelight, but I wanted to see if I could at least get a usable image. And I think it did pretty well. There's certainly some noise there, but bear in mind that these samples have had no denoising applied at all. As you push the ISO above 3200, it certainly starts showing noise. By ISO 25600, the noise is pretty intrusive. On the other hand, the image is still recognizable, at least. All of these tests were shot in log. I did a quick comparison between log 2 and log 3, and it looks like C-log 2 handles the low light shooting a little better than C-log 3, but the difference isn't huge. In any case, the C70 looks like a pretty usable camera for low light shooting. The C70 supports a pretty complex set of frame rates and codecs, but actually if you work your way through the menu, it's not too hard to get set up. There are a few odd caveats though, so let's walk through the process. So, working your way down the menu, here's how you can select the modes you want. First, you can pick Super 35 or Super 16 crop mode. I haven't looked at the Super 16 modes, which of course are 2K at best. I guess if you want that, it's there. Then there's your system frequency. 59.94 for NTSC, 50.00 for PAL, and 24.00. The system frequency determines the frame rates you get, which works pretty much as you would expect. The 24.00 frame rate is only available with the system frequency set to 24.00. In NTSC mode, you get 23.976, which they call 23.98. Changing the system frequency basically reboots the camera, but that only takes a few seconds, and you won't be doing this very often. Then pick your main rec format, which is basically what codec you want. Choose from the options in this table. For RAW, you have the ST and LT variants. ST is less compressed, about 6.4 to 1, whereas LT is about 10 to 1. 59.94 is only available in LT. You can shoot RAW HQ, but only in 2K crop resolution, which seems a little pointless to me. For 422 10-bit, which is what I guess most non-RAW people would shoot, you've got XF-AVC, where AVC means H.264, and MP4HEVC, which is H.265. Once you've set those, then choose your resolution, which in turn controls your bitrate. In RAW modes, your resolution is fixed at 4096 by 2160, or 2048 by 1080 in 2K crop mode. In the H.264 modes, you have a choice between long GOP and all intra recording. In the H.265 modes, it's long GOP only. The all intra modes are limited to less than 30 frames per second. To get 50 or 59.94, you have to shoot long GOP. So what codec should you shoot? Well, for my money, all of the codecs here offer roughly equivalent quality. The bit rates have been pretty well balanced out, so that, for example, the All-I codecs will give you about the same quality as long-GOP. So for me, the choice of codec comes down to what suits your workflow. My Codecs video covers this subject, but basically use long GOP to get small, manageable files, or use all intra where you might get faster, smoother editing. I'm not convinced that there's much benefit to RAW in general. In particular, resolution will be determined by the sensor, not the codec, but the extra bit depth of RAW can be very useful for VFX work, like chroma key. I think log shooting is well worth it for the dynamic range. C-Log 2 and C-Log 3 seem to be the ones to choose from. A lot of people reckon C-Log 2 has the edge, particularly for holding shadows, but I'm not sure it's a huge difference. I shoot H.265 and C-Log 3, mainly to be compatible with my R5. And finally, whatever codec you use, any workflow disadvantages can be erased by using a proxy workflow. I have a video on that too. So before I bought the camera, I was curious about its bit rates. This is kind of hard to figure out because the number of combinations is really crazy. In particular, there's nothing online that I could find, even on Canon's websites, about the bit rates for slow and fast recording, because there the number of combinations just really explodes. So here's a quick rundown of some of the camera's bit rates. I'm not going to go through them all because there really are just way too many. But here are some samples for 4K recording in 10-bit 422 or 12-bit RAW using the full Super 35 sensor and in normal recording mode. I'll get to slow and fast recording in a bit. The bit rates in normal recording mode are pretty simple and really just depend on your choice of codec and whether your frame rate is above or below 30. The RAW modes are a bit more complex because they change for every frame rate. For each codec, I've shown the bitrate in megabits per second, which is how the rates are usually discussed, megabytes per second, which is how memory cards are rated, and gigabytes per hour, which shows how fast you'll use up storage. There's some random plus and minus due to the variable compressibility of video, but it's pretty minor. The speeds I measured in RAW modes were actually slightly higher than the table shows. For example, in XFAVC All Intra, you'll be chewing through 185 gigabytes per hour. Personally, I usually shoot MP4 long GOP using a 256 gigabyte V60 memory card and an A30 battery. With that, the battery life and card capacity are both about 3 hours, which suits me fine. The RAW modes are fairly strongly compressed to fit within the SD card's bitrate. For RAW ST, the compression ratio is about 6.4 to 1. For LT, it's about 10 to 1. The last column shows what SD card you need to use for each mode. I've starred the V30 cards because the camera always seems to give me a warning when I use a V30 card, even though the numbers suggest that it should work. You can just ignore the warnings and record anyway, but of course that's at your own risk. I definitely recommend using a V-rated card anyway. Slow and fast mode lets you set your target frame rate as per normal, like 24 frames per second for example, but then set the camera to shoot at a higher frame rate, so that when your footage plays back at the target frame rate, it's slowed down. In the menus, the camera displays the playback bitrate for whatever slow and fast mode you're in. The record bitrate is going to be that number multiplied by your slowdown factor. That tells you the amount of data being physically written to the memory card, which in turn tells you what kind of memory card you need. There are a lot of slow and fast mode combinations. There are well over 20 different speeds you can shoot at. You're usually going to be shooting above 30 frames per second, and that's only available with long GOP mode. Slow and fast doesn't work with RAW shooting. So let's look at a representative sample of some of the bit rates you might see based on shooting at 30, 60 and 120 frames per second and targeting 24 frames per second. The table basically shows how it works across the board, the only wrinkle being slightly higher bit rates if you target 25 frames per second. So as you can see, you can get a maximum slowdown of 5 times with a record bitrate of 540 megabits per second. You can shoot at a higher frame rate, up to 180 frames per second, with a resolution of 2K by using a 2K center crop of the image sensor. If you want the ultimate slowdown, that's the way to get it. The table shows what memory card speed classes should work for each mode, based on the bit rates. You'll see stars on some of them because, again, the camera seems a bit over-conservative. In fact, I think the speed warnings might be a bit buggy because sometimes I don't get warnings when I clearly should. For safety, maybe just stick to V90 cards for slow and fast recording. One odd thing you might notice online is people saying that the C70 doesn't shoot stills, which is odd because it does, but it seems that Canon have bent over backwards to hide this feature. In Canon's defence, everything I'm about to tell you is in the manual, but that's such a monstrosity and there are so many weird caveats, I'm not surprised people have had trouble with this. So let me see if I can talk you through the process. The first thing you have to do is assign one of the function buttons to Photo. That then becomes your shutter button. But then there are a number of caveats to dance around. First, the camera won't shoot stills while filming. You have to be in standby, so fair enough. But it also won't shoot stills if pre-record is enabled, or if you have a slow and fast mode active, or if browser remote is connected, even if you're not actually filming. And even then, for some reason, stills only get stored to slot B, regardless of what your selected slot is. If you don't have a card in slot B, then you won't get any stills. But anyway, once you get past all of that, it's easy. The camera shoots plain JPEG images only, and it uses whatever resolution and mode you're shooting video in, so no more than 8 megapixels, which makes perfect sense to me for a cinema camera. It's great for production reference stills or social posts or things like that. One thing to bear in mind is that if you're shooting log, the stills will also be log, which is okay. You can apply a LUT in Photoshop or the GIMP or even your video editor. In fact, having your photos taken with exactly the same modes you're shooting video in could be very useful. You can preview your stills on the camera just like you would preview your movies, but you have to make sure that you have the right card slot and media type selected. So that's rather a lot of words for what is really a pretty minor feature of the camera, and there's no doubt that Canon could have made this a lot smoother. But once you've figured it out, still shooting really works fine. I hit the shutter button every time I take a movie to create a reference still, and it works great. So maybe you'll find this useful too. One of the things I really wanted from my camera was some kind of remote control option. Now the C70 doesn't work with the usual Canon remote apps like Camera Connect. There are wired options, but it's hard to figure out what works with the camera. In any case, I wanted wireless. So the good news is that the C70 has a feature called Browser Remote, which lets you remote control the camera over Wi-Fi from any web browser. The bad news is that setting up Wi-Fi is a bit of a fiddle. There are 3 things you can do with Wi-Fi on the C70. You can file transfer movies to an FTP server, you can stream, and you can use Browser Remote. I haven't tried the file transfer or the streaming, so here I'll just be talking about Browser Remote. The big problem is that the C70 doesn't actually have Wi-Fi, so you need to use an external dongle. And the dongle has to match one of the device drivers that Canons have built into the C70's firmware. And that means you need to match the name of one of Canon's supported dongles exactly. Dongle manufacturers change the chips inside their dongles all the time, so the big name of the dongle doesn't necessarily guarantee that it will work. I'm going to put up a link to the list of dongles that Canon officially support for the C70. Anyway, once you find a compatible dongle, getting it set up is not too bad. Use the wizard, and the manual does basically tell you what you need to know. One tip I would have is assign one of the camera buttons to status. You'll need to get to the status screens to get to the IP address of the camera. The camera's Wi-Fi has 2 modes. In infrastructure mode, the camera connects to an existing Wi-Fi router, or router if you're on that side of the Atlantic, and can then be controlled by any device like a phone or tablet or even a PC on the same Wi-Fi network. This is great for a home or a studio setup, but it's no good out in the wilderness where there is no Wi-Fi. In that case, what you need is camera access point mode. In this mode, the camera sets itself up as a hotspot, which you then connect to with your phone or tablet or whatever. That's how I mostly use it. Although Canon publish a list of web browsers that they support, it seems to be a well-written web app that pretty much works on any modern web browser. I've tried it on Chrome, Edge, Firefox and Opera, on Windows and Android, and it seemed to work fine. The one niggle being that in Firefox, clicking to set the focus didn't seem to work. The other browsers were fine. I don't have an Apple device to try it with, but Safari on iOS is listed as supported. Once browser remote is running, you can bring up a live view. This shows you where your current focus point is, which you can click to move, except on Firefox, and it also shows you what the camera is focused on if face tracking is active. You can start and stop recording and add metadata. If you use a larger screen device, like a tablet, then you get more options, like the ability to set exposure options, select a focus mode, and select the memory card slot. This could be worth the hassle of lugging a larger device around. There are a few niggly points. There's no LUT on browser remote, so if you shoot log, that can be a bit of a pain. Another one is that if you don't touch the phone for a while, then you get logged out and have to log back in again. But if you have your browser save your credentials, then that's just a click. One thing that really frustrates me is that there's no preview option. I would really like to be able to preview the last shot I took on the phone with audio, so I know I got a good shot. As it stands, I have to go over to the camera to do that, which I can live with, but a preview would be nice. Overall, browser remote seems like a really useful option. It works well and it can save you a lot of time. The only big hassle is finding a compatible dongle, but if you can get past that, then it's definitely worth looking at. So I know I've raised a lot of points about this camera, but in practice these are really small niggles. I've been using this camera heavily since I got it, I think over 100 shooting sessions, and it's been great. What it delivers in such a small package seems fantastic to me. It's a dream to use, and it really has all the features I could want, and it delivers a great picture. The issues I've mentioned really aren't a big deal in practice. By far the biggest impact to me is having to uniquely rename my clips when I unload them onto my computer, and I have to do that for my other cameras anyway. The fit and finish might not be perfect, but once you're using the camera, you don't notice it. Overall, the C70 has been a fantastic workhorse for me. In any case, I hope this video has filled in a few bits of knowledge about the camera, and thanks for watching.